Hi there, welcome to day one of our Holy Week daily devotional thoughts. What I'd like to do this week is to just spend a little bit of time each day during Holy Week looking at some texts that will help us explore a question that came up during our sermon this past Sunday on April the 5th. At the end of our story in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus is coming into the city of Jerusalem. The whole city is shook, and the people listening in are asking, who is this guy? And as I said in the sermon, that is a really good question. I'd like to spend this week exploring that question. So the church traditionally, the lectionary has a series of readings that are traditionally observed during this Holy Week. And so a reading that's for today, Monday, of the week before Easter, is John chapter 12, verses 1 to 11. So I want to spend a moment here and read this story carefully, talk a little bit about it, and then see if there's something of interest here. John chapter 12, 1 to 11. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with them. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who would betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." When the great crowd of Jews learned that he was there, they came not only because of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priest planned to put Lazarus to death as well, since it was on account of him that many Jews were deserting and believing in Jesus. So there is just a ton going on in this story. Lots of things to pull out. First of all, you need to back up to John chapter 11 if you haven't heard the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Jesus had this family in Bethany, just a few miles from Jerusalem, and it seems like it was a place that Jesus would stop and stay whenever he had a business in Jerusalem to attend to. And so this family, Mary and Martha, had a brother Lazarus who was sick and eventually died. And 4 days after he had died, 4 days after the funeral, Jesus arrived. And then Jesus came to the tomb where Lazarus had been laid, and Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb. This was just a few days or perhaps weeks before the story that we're reading here. So, if you've raised somebody from the dead, I can't even imagine what that reception would be like. Like, what do you do for the guy that raises your brother from the dead? You throw him a party, apparently. And so this would have been an extravagant party. And so Martha is here, the older sister. She is serving food. She's playing the role of host. They mention that Lazarus has a seat at the table, which would have just been amazing. Having died, having been buried, and then being raised back. At the end of the story here, we get this great line here that this crowd came not just because of Jesus, but because the dead guy was back alive again, and they just wanted to see this. So this was front page news. Crowds of people came not just for the dinner, but just came to even look at it. And surprisingly, at the end, the chief priests they're so whack that they're even planning to kill Lazarus a second time because too many people are believing in Jesus and the ministry that Jesus is providing. So a ton of things are going on here at this story. But what's at the center of the story is this abundant and extravagant gift. Mary has this bottle of perfume. Now we're told that it is a pound of pure nard. And so this would have been an extravagant, abundant, expensive gift. Judas says it could have been sold for 300 denarii. And a denarii would be considered a day's wage. And so if you thought a day's wage for a minimum wage earner would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $120, if you do the math, that's $30,000, $35,000 for this bottle of perfume. And it's the kind of perfume, once you break the neck of the bottle, once you crack open the seal, it's out there. You can't just kind of unstopper the lid and just pour a little bit out. It's an all or nothing kind of gift. And that's part of what's happening here. Mary, out of just the abundance of her heart, out of the abundance of gratitude, makes this spectacular gift. Now, Jesus, in turn, interprets it to be sort of a forward-thinking gift. And it's kind of funny. He says, Mary bought this for my burial. Now, nobody's talking about Jesus' burial here, but Jesus is already kind of proleptically forward-thinking, looking ahead to what was about to take place. What he takes here is that this is a sign of great gratitude, great love, and it's a symbol for what's to come. As we know, at the end of this week, there's going to be another extravagant and abundant sign of love, that Jesus is on his way to the cross. Mary is anticipating this, maybe without her even knowing. But with that abundant gift in mind, we have this conflict at the heart of it. So you've got Judas, who John just lays it right out. Judas was not one of the disciples. He is an anti-disciple. He was not following Jesus, but he was almost opposing Jesus. John uses a word here to describe him. He is a thief. It's strong language. There was no mixing words here. Judas wasn't a tragic, misled kind of guy, but instead there was just harsh words of judgment here. Judas calls this out and says it's a waste. He says, this is, we should have saved the money. We've got poor people that we're trying to look after here, Jesus. Why would you allow something like this to be used, just kind of thrown away like this? But on the other side, we have this sign of devotion and love. Judas would like to have us believe that these two things are in conflict. We've got justice and compassion, and then we've got devotion and love. And Judas is saying, you got to pick a side here. Are we going to go with compassion, or are we going to go with love? Are we going to go with justice for the poor, or are we going to go with devotion to Jesus? And interestingly, we get a picture of what Jesus is like here. Jesus, he calls into question the whole idea that this is an either-or thing. In other translations or in other versions of this story in other Gospels, Jesus says you'll always have the poor with you. And Jesus isn't saying that to mean that we shouldn't worry about the poor or care for the poor. That's at the core of Jesus' message. That's the essence of what Jesus is here to address. But Jesus says it's not a matter of either or. It's a both and. Jesus says we need to be about justice and we need to be about compassion, but at the same time, we're also about devotion and love. That gives us an insight into what Jesus is all about. That Jesus receives these extravagant and these abundant gifts while at the same time caring desperately about the needs of the needy and of the poor. So on our way to Jerusalem here, as we begin Holy Week, we catch just a glimpse of who Jesus is like, his compassionate heart, and the way he receives gifts of love and gifts of devotion.